Next, we'll have Kairos Shen. Before he became a professor of the practice in this department, Kairos was the director of planning at the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the BRA, which was Boston's economic development and planning agency. He was there for 13 years, from 1993 to 2015. And as Boston's chief urban planner, Kairos was intimately involved in many of the city's most important planning and economic development initiatives, including the development of the Seaport district from essentially, from what I understand, a very large parking lot to what you see today. And as many of us are residents or visitors to Boston, we've all been to the Seaport district and are excited to learn about the making. So thank you, Kairos.
Thank you. First of all, what's my time? Because I should be actually on a panel right now, right? So it's 1:36. Tell me what. So we're way behind schedule.
The time is supposed to be 20 minutes. What time is it now? 1:35. You're supposed to start at.
Okay,
so
so I'll try to do this quickly.
We'll cut short our coffee break.
Okay, no, it's okay. So how many people have been to the South Boston Innovation District? Does it appear to be innovative? Or is it just another piece of commercial real estate development? So a lot of people will say there's nothing intrinsic about the place itself physically that makes it innovative. But what I want to share with you is the 30 years of planning that led up to this district, of which the innovative district part was only a small portion of its overall development. I want to start by we're here today at MIT, right here, and this is the innovation district around 2000. And you can see at that time, it was mostly open land. It's right adjacent to downtown. At that time, not yet connected to the airport. And then, of course, the rest of the city, many of you, if you know the city, the notion of the preservation of the historic areas that were built in the 19th century through the extension of the downtown through the High Spine, which was an urban design and planning concept advocated by Kevin Lynch, who of course taught here for many years. Now, of course, some of you will also know some of the big projects, the highway projects, and then the extension, and you can see in this map already, the excavation of the Seaport Access Road, which was part of the Big Dig project, which was the submersion of the highway, the central north-south highway, and the extension of a highway, the east-west highway, to connect to the airport, and therefore opening up this land that was predominantly industrial before.
Railway before that.
Railway, yes. Well, actually still railway. This isn't working very well. Okay, so this is an aerial map of Boston. Now, much of the conversation today, up till now, has been talking about the expansion of new districts or new cities. The presumption in all of these cases is that the acquisition of land and the public control of the land is sort of, we just assume that the city can do that or the government can do that. Now, Boston, of course, is a high-price real estate market. And the control of land in our city and its history has been quite a concern and not easily presumed. Here is the shoreline from 1630, before urbanization really occurred in Boston. And you can see, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the South Boston or Seaport, which you can see here is all reclaimed land. And then, of course, other parts, before we reclaimed this, the only way that the city of Boston was able to expand was its actually making of land. And there are many great historical accounts of how land making was an important part. Now, actually, just as a digression, I believe that in the future we will be making land again, right? Because actually we will be losing land to climate change and sea level rise, and because of the way the real estate market are structured. I don't think we can solve this problem by reallocating existing land that is already in peak private ownership, and the public will be again in the business of land making.
Yeah, that's not the map from 2050, is it?
No. the sea edge are the existing edges that exist. Now, MIT, we're sitting on a little piece of reclaimed land right here. Okay, so Patrick showed Serdar's 1854 map of the expansion. Now, back in the 1850s, the phenomena of land making and city expansions was all the rage. In Boston at the time, 1856, there was a plan of actually expanding from the Shomet Peninsula to the Back Bay, which was done in 1856 by somebody less famous than Serdar, a local guy, Arthur Gilman. Sort of straightforward plan, 400 acres of expansion, started reclamation in 1858, and look at it. I use this as a reference point because even then, we were making land and the public was selling it as a way of financing this expansion. Now, this is 1836. The railway causeway, this was actually tidal marshland, part of the city's sewer system. So at that time, of course, many of the European cities were also reclaiming and expanding land, not just for expansion, but for cleaning up and sanitizing the urban environment, right? Here it is, a little bit from east to west, reducing this bog along the railway causeway. You can see some of this is the public garden and the first of on Arlington Street, and the emergence of the Commonwealth Avenue. 1888, mostly complete. This is, by the way, the Mass Ave, which crosses over to Cambridge, and we're sitting right here. Look at this. So how did the public do this? The public didn't want to actually at the time sell bonds and incur debt to extend the city. So what it did instead was that we laid out a plan, and we were able to hire the contractors to bring dirt from different parts of the Commonwealth and to actually reclaim these parcels according to a plan. Now, critical to that is that there was a reservation about a third of the land for the public domain, something you talked about, Patrick, about laying out the arterial grids. Preservation, at that time, many of you know, Olmsted's idea of a great green boulevard right down here connecting the common and the public garden, and then eventually to the fens, right? And then, of course, the tiny little trees. Now, I wonder whether they were as critical of this plan as they were in the 21st century when I was working for the city. Oh, this will never work. Too much public space, not enough private development. Now, 1/3 of that land was reserved for the public, for open spaces and for public rights of ways. Now then another 1/7 was reserved for public institutions, including places like MIT, which started actually on the Back Bay side. Now, it's amazing what 100 years, 120 years can do. It can turn bad urban planning, very simplistic urban design into quite a remarkable place. Now, the challenge for us over here at the end of the 20th century and the 21st century is that how can we remake and extend the city in a way that actually is an extension, a natural extension of the city, not physically, but also economically. Now, so flip around, right? We were just looking at the city this way. We're now looking at the district. This is an aerial from 2005. And you can see the completion of the highway system, mostly underground. And then all still the lot of the open parking lots. And then some development, which we'll come back to. And one of the first projects I worked on was the building of the largest building in the New England area, which is the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center. Now, I show you this because pivoted around the downtown core was, of course, the historic districts. And then now on this side, what is the future? What was the vision? At that time, starting in the 1980s, the notion was that this district, because of its proximity to the downtown, shouldn't be an expansion of the downtown. Like, maybe not quite an industrial park, but effectively functioning, the downtown at that time was kind of functioning like an industrial park. People didn't live here. They worked here, they commuted here, and then they lived in other places that were more, more beautiful, right? More hospitable. Now I show you this, so here's the 1,000 acres, and I noticed that Martin, in your cities, the smallest of these new cities was about 3 square kilometers, right? This is 4 square kilometers. So in your chart, it would be one of the smallest. Now remember I showed you the 400 acres. The challenge is, does it make sense to replicate this in about half of the 1,000 acres that we have here? Now let me show you that again because I love this image. Right, but the notion here is that the dimension from where the public garden to the fence is almost exactly the same size as the Back Bay, and if you were to take all of the other open space elements that were designed in the 1850s by Olmsted, what was also missing in this district is this kind of open space. The challenge, though, is that while we were able to reserve 1/3 of the land for public open space, most of this land in the South Boston waterfront district was privately owned. So how do you do this? Comes back to the question of the public-private sector partnership, right? And what I want to concentrate on today is to talk about how the public sector, without the money or the resource to take private land at market prices, how it actually accomplishes a new public realm and a new subdivisioning in a district that it had no real land control. Okay, so of course I've already mentioned the highway. So the public did have some money. The city, so here's the important thing. Unlike many of the places that we saw earlier today, where the public had not only the resources to build infrastructure, but also resources allocated to city making, many of you know in America, in the US, there is no city making budget anymore. So while the public had the money to extend the highway, because there's of course support for highway, there was no support for city making. One of the great things about the Big Dig in submerging the highway, it was able to create, while building a new highway or reconstructing an existing highway, a new city making element such as these surface parks. And then of course, the other element is how do you actually connect a district, not only through highway, but through the extension of a network of a subway system. So as part of this highway construction, there was an extension of what is now known as the Silver Line that connects South Station to the waterfront and then eventually to the airport. And that's the bus that you might have taken if you came from the airport this time. And then the challenge is to connect the pedestrian and existing street networks into a district that didn't have a street network until the highway was completed. Oh. So this is the highway that we got the federal government to pay for. Now you will see that they only created enough surface roads to feed the ramps. And then they said, city, you figure out how to negotiate with these private landowners to actually then cut the next scale of city grids. So what we did was, and now in Boston, of course, so these are some of the things that the public invested in. We invested in the subway station. This is a very grandiose station. There's a story behind it, which I won't get into today. The city at the time believed that investing in the city and the state investing in a convention center to stimulate the visitor economy was an important component, so that there was public funding for this. And then, of course, the notion that the district would be anchored first by a new federal courthouse to elevate the civic character of the district was also important. So these were early projects, in addition to the highway, that the city and state invested in. Now, in the meantime, the city engaged private consultants and the community in developing what we call the public realm plan. some of the simple notions, and we haven't talked about design much. I think this last presentation was the first time we talked about design. I wanted to ask the first question of the first panel, is that all of these economic indicators suggest that design has nothing to do with the successful of any of these districts. Now, I'd like to think that badly designed places with the right economic indicators are still going to fail, right? Or you could say that design won't make a place that is in the wrong place to work, but at least it'll make it a destination, I think, for architects anyway. So this notion of how do you carve this secondary system, now making more land and not erasing development activity by adding piers and so on. And then here was the notion that this district could have the kind of scale that we related to in the Back Bay earlier on. Now, the big debate, of course, is it an extension of the downtown, or should it now be a more mixed-use neighborhood? And what would support the city's economy better in the long run? Now, it turns out we took a line not so dissimilar to what Patrick said, which was that we would negotiate with the developers for the parcelization of the land through the incentive of added density. So essentially trading density for public amenities and the kinds of things that the public sector was not able to, or in some cases not willing to do. And then the notion here is that, you know what, even though the highway was originally designed to support an expansion of downtown, that we are now actually envisioning this place to be more of a mixed-use district because downtowns are actually not the model for extending cities. Okay, now, so what we didn't do was that we didn't incorporate a defined set of zoning rules for this district. Because Boston is famous for its discretionary zoning because of the one thing I think, Martin, you raised, which is that if you do a plan, you upzone, you give away all the value to the landowners and the private developers. And then you have no more leverage. So in Boston, what we do is that we set guidelines up, but we deliberately actually lower the zoning so that any developer who wants to develop has to come to the public sector and say, hey, here's what I'd like to build on my 23 acres. Here's what I'd like to build in the 33 acres that I own. Now, what would you allow me to build? And I'm willing to give you things that you otherwise would have to pay for yourself. Okay? I know a lot of the planners don't like this, but I'm going to demonstrate to you that defined zoning is not a substitute for design process where there's negotiation. So I'm not going to go into this. I can spend the entire afternoon talking about the discretionary process that we have here, but I want to leave you with a sense of the things that we care about. So developers care about this sort of the economic benefit. And then we talked about a lot of this, that the justification for expanding cities and new districts is all about the capital investment, the job creation, and new tax revenues. That should not be developers, even though they claim it to be the benefits that they provide the city, is really just intrinsic to the development and investment they could make anywhere in the world. And we acknowledge they don't have to necessarily choose our city, but when they make that decision, they're also making decisions that benefit them from a private perspective. Now, in our city, even though we don't have a defined set of zoning rules, we do have required benefits that are related to predefined development exactions. Here in Boston, we have housing and job linkage, which is private commercial development have to pay a certain dollar amount to the city for housing creation and job training because they're expanding our economy, and we want them to actually provide the training so that our residents can access it. Then, of course, for residential projects, there's a now requirement for affordable housing creation because, of course, the public sector is, as you know, retreated from the building of affordable housing in the United States. And then, of course, critical is that the project has to mitigate the negative impacts it has on the community. Now, the big piece is this. Every developer, because they don't have entitlements already for their projects, need to negotiate with the public. And here's a menu of the kinds of things that is negotiated through the development review process. Public access and accommodation, public realm and infrastructure, and I'll show you some of the infrastructure that we negotiated. Civic and cultural programs, right? Not provided by the public, actually, now being subsidized by the private developer. Local community needs, almost anything. Community centers, I even say the local Pop Warner football team's uniform, right? And actually, the local barbershop that's displaced by the development that could have subsidized rental space in the new development. Public policy objectives. I'm going to talk specifically about the innovation agenda. Like, how does the private sector actually subsidize that? Or not subsidize, pay for. Design and performance of the actual buildings themselves, and of course public art, not to scratch out the public part, but privately funded public art projects. Okay, so Fan Pier, 23 acres of land. This is 1996. You can see all of the, highway was stopped here. The airport is over here. 1986, Boston had our own version of Canary Wharf, right? You can see it. This is Caesar Pally. The same thing that was designed for Canary Wharf, and actually not so different than the one in Battery Park City. The notion of creating its own enclave and also its own canal, because who knows where South Boston is if there isn't a canal? Now, it took 3 years for the public to negotiate a plan with the Pritzker family, famous for the Pritzker Architectural Prize. I think this plan wouldn't have won a Pritzker Prize. Right? But the notion of a grid that was relating to the existing street grid, but public open spaces and streets that were created on private property without any land taking. Here it is. In exchange, the public gave entitlements of 2.9 million square feet. Now, the attendant sort of new tax revenues and construction jobs that would be over the period of the construction of the 9 buildings. They were required to pay a little close to $11 million, $11.5 million in housing and job training payments. And then 10% of the residential would be on-site affordable units. Now here was so at that time, the critical public agenda was not innovation, but to create a public destination that was worthy of a visit by people coming to Boston. So 57% of the site was actually going to be either new streets, sidewalks, or open spaces. There would be a requirement for dedicating 107,000 square foot that the developer would build to house public civic amenities. And then they were to dredge for recreation, the cove, and then create all of this, what we call the harbor walk and the harbor walk system, to allow the public to enjoy the water. And because the resource that this place had access to is the harbor front, the developer was required to set aside money, $1 million, to help subsidize public water transportation that would be implemented while in cooperation with the Public Transportation Authority. This is 2005, 4 years after the entitlements were given. Because the markets were not ready, no private development was executed. Instead, the one site that the developer signed a 99-year lease with the Institute of Contemporary Art they were able to raise $60 million to build a new facility. This is now, of course, the ICA that you know well. It was the first building, or first real building built by Dennis Scafidio Renfro. Oh, by the way, they agreed to do a temporary harbor wall to connect this public facility to the existing public right-of-way, which the closest is here, and then also to cut a pedestrian path across the parking lot in order for people coming from walking to actually get to this facility. So here's some of the temporary harbor walk. This is the ICA now next to a piece of the open space that has been built. 2009, world financial crisis. The developer had already started building a single building, and then the economy stopped. Now what happened? You know, Patrick, you said that the public should not get into the way of actually determining land uses. Get out of the way, let the private sector figure that out. Now what we had been doing was that we took the same attitude along the way, which is that let the market determine what the best uses would be. And they kept on saying to the mayor and to the public sector, look, we need to have the flexibility to adapt to market demands. And we are actually looking at all of the kinds of tenants, credit-worthy tenants, that we could then actually borrow money in order to build buildings on these parcels. Now it turns out, while they were making this argument for 5-6 years, actually from 2001 to 2009, it turns out when the world financial crisis actually happened, the credit-worthy tenants were the first to disappear. So the mayor said, oh my God, you know, I knew there was something wrong with this plan. Kairos, you and your planners gave too much latitude to the private sector to determine and negotiate the use with you. Now, at the same time this was happening, the one part of the economy in the Boston area that remained vital was some of the small fishes, right? We've heard a lot of big fish, small fish. Big fish can borrow money when the markets are good. Small fish are just biting at the edge. But it turns out when the markets are down, the big fish are the first to disappear. So the mayor basically said, look, why aren't we building around the innovation economy, the small fishes, and to encourage that? And what could the public sector do in order to actually encourage that to happen? Now, so we were looking, so this was the kind of plan that we'd stitched together with the private developer. At the time of the financial crisis, there was still about 20 million square foot, 19 to 20 million square foot to be built out. You've seen this photograph earlier on today. Now we looked at this, the physical infrastructure was already established. There was a nice public realm that was emerging. The first major institution, together with the Children's Museum not far away, were already there. And then, of course, there was an old Navy base at the far end that the city actually owned that could provide the industrial base. The first company, by the way, that moved to the South Boston waterfront was the old John Hancock insurance company. So this notion that actually so in that regard, the movers were the traditional big fishers. And then, of course, the question was, how much housing? I'm not going to get into that, except to say that the political discussion about how much housing this new district would have was one of the most controversial topics with the political leaders, the community, as well as the private sector developers. And then, of course, there was a 19th century warehouse district there that was housing the largest artist community in the New England area. And there was already a kind of diversity of uses. All things that I think when we were looking at other competitive cities that had innovative clusters had. Now, so in terms of planning, what we did was that we didn't tweak the physical plan. What we did was that we looked at the kinds of uses. So at the time, there was only 8% of the existing use that was dedicated to residential. In our plan, it was going to be 22%. But when we adopted this innovation strategy, we said we need to up the innovation, up the residential, because it turns out that having people live in a district was part of the critical nature to encouraging a more human interaction and more sort of friction between people. The other thing that we increased was cultural and education. Now that was a huge debate because if you know, Kendall Square is one of the great sort of innovation districts that happened over a 50-year period. And there was a lot of debate with the mayor about whether without an MIT in this new district, that you could actually create an innovative cluster. So actually the mayor asked to visit with all of the local university presidents, including at that time, President Hockfield. He hosted them in that one building and looked and said to the presidents, we would love to invite you here to be our anchor institution. And of course, President Hockfield at the time at MIT said, I had no idea this was so close to Kendall Square. Right? Harvard University, you would imagine, came over and they said, wow, this is a really good idea. They developed their own innovation district right next to Harvard Business School because they can, right? So none of the institutions actually joined us. It turned out that one institution that rented a small 1,000 square foot space was Babson College because they wanted a footprint in the city. But the notion here of how an innovation district could actually occur without anchor institutions is another kind of question I'm not going to answer today except to say that we sort of bungled our way through it. And then, of course, the other piece is R&D space. Sort of non-traditional Class A office space. Reduce the Class A office space in return for more flexible kinds of workspaces. And that was the major change. Now, how we were able to implement this was that it turns out that there was a project that another big project that was undergoing development review at the same time. This is the 33 acres. So here's the fan pier with ICA. All of this land was being permitted at the time. They were looking for 7 million square foot of development. And so we said, well, Mayor, we don't have any money in the city, but we have this big developer who wants entitlements from us. Maybe we can get them to help us implement this agenda. So here's what happened. Here's the plan first developed by KPF. It was started permitting in 2006. Of course, the crisis happened 2 years. And we said, you know what? Instead of pursuing more and an extraordinary amount of public open space, what we want instead is that you contribute elements to the innovation agenda, which there were two anchor pieces to. So let me just say that the time when we finally negotiated in 2010, there's the intrinsic benefits, which I won't talk about. There were more housing and job linkage than Fan Pier, which was right next door. 15% instead of 10% on-site affordable housing. And then here we go. Instead of 57% of the site devoted to public realm, only we were happy to live with 20% less. But the cultural and innovation space that the developer had to provide was upped. Now, not as much as Fan Pier, but still 36,000 square feet. And we reinvented two categories that didn't exist in the zoning land use map. One is innovation housing. So in addition to affordable housing, we asked the developer to provide innovation housing. And we asked for 20% innovation uses in the commercial spaces. So what are these things? Well, the lawyers got very kind of like anxious. It's not defined by zoning. Like, what are you talking about? And what happened now? So this is really important. What happened during the financial crisis was that the normal procedures of how a city does planning was, the city was relieved from some of the process. So instead of hiring a consultant to do a 1-year study, 1.5-year study, to make a recommendation that would be presented to the board and the communities, the mayor basically said, Kairos, I don't care what you do. You just figure it out with the developers, right? So we negotiated this basically, with the developers, something that they could do and they were willing to do. and that we left a lot of these. We said we will know innovation housing when we see it, and we will know innovation use when we see it. Now, so there was still so when this plan was implemented, they still had to build some of the open spaces. So at that time, some of you might have recall that there was this notion of doing micro units in other cities in order to reduce the cost to the developers. So we had the developers come in a summit to talk about what innovation housing is. And one of the things that we said was that not micro housing, although we would lower the city's requirement for minimum housing unit sizes, but we wanted projects that actually supplemented the small units with also lots of public shared spaces. So a few of these projects were built. The smallest of these units are 350 square feet. Now, innovation uses, we said, you want to promote local uses and small businesses, but that we would also allow for, let's say, commercial, large national tenants. But we wanted them to actually explore and bring in components of their business that wasn't already in the city of Boston. So an example I gave the developers that if you tenant the building with a crate and barrel, it won't be an innovation use because we already have several of them in the city. But at that time, there was no CB2 in the city of Boston. So you can have crate and barrel, but make it a CB2 so that we are diversifying our retail offerings. Now, by the way, one of the innovation uses, if you go down to this project, is LLB. There was no LLB at the time in Boston. And so the developer got credit for LLB being an innovative use. But all of us know that LLB is not an innovative use, right? Tugboats have been around for a long time. Now, the other sort of crown jewel was a 12,000 square foot facility that became District Hall, which is the first public innovation center in the world, as far as we know, that's privately owned. So we leveraged a 10-year deal on what was to be a park parcel on the other side of the ICA. So the ICA is here. This was part of the developer building that was sitting in 2009 and part of a park that they built. And then here's the innovation center. And instead of the public saying, you know what, we're going to run this innovation center, the one thing we did was that we said, you know what, we're going to put you in partnership with Cambridge Innovation Center and their Venture Cafe Foundation, because you guys know the innovation economy better than we do. And we would step away from this partnership. And what we did was that we arranged for the restaurant revenue to go towards funding the operation and programming for this innovation center. It's now one of the most important sort of destinations for the innovation economy down there. So the two things, one was to create innovation housing to encourage more young people to live in the district. And the second thing is to actually allow for the social infrastructure to support innovation. Now, very different. Remember earlier on this morning, we heard about how most innovation districts, the government pays for, well, they pick and choose. Remember? Free aviation, display industry, and bioscience. Well, there was, by the way, in the city at that time, a great question about, okay, so you don't have an anchor institution. At least you should pick some industry. And then we resisted that because the problem with governments sort of picking industries is that the question is, what are the economic development tools that you can bring to bear to actually help them? And many of the innovation economy and ecosystem are not around long enough to be able to actually benefit from the traditional economic development tools that a city can bring. Tax breaks. Oh, I'm gone by the time I file my taxes, or I may not be here. And so these are the kinds of questions that I think that the notion of sort of being much more agile in the negotiation of the developer allowed the city to actually implement. So here it is. The only thing it turns out that actually breeds innovation more than, well, coffee breeds innovation. And all of the coffee sort of money, revenue was being thrown back into actually supporting the program. I want to show you this. This was permitted in 2001. This was permitted in 2010. I've already talked about how the percentage of residential before innovation on this site was 36%. After innovation, 44%, although in a more recent renegotiation with the developer, the proportion has gone down because they actually, well, they got Amazon, so they needed more commercial square foot. Housing contributions and job contributions quite different. The requirement for housing, inclusionary housing, is very different. And you can see these are the 2021 regulations. So almost double the amount that this developer was going to pay, both in the housing and jobs. Now, I say this because we haven't talked about this at all today, which is one of the things that when government implement planning policy, developers always say, give me certainty, and I want to be treated just like every other developer. Well, in Boston, neither are true. You don't get treated. It depends on when you actually ask the question for your entitlements. So consistency is not one of the hallmarks of Boston's city-making process. Look at this. The negotiated benefits. 3.6% of the uses in Van Pier, 1.9%. Public realm, you can see the dramatic discrepancies. Now, transportation. I'm not going to talk about this because that's not the focus of this talk. But then you can see the requirements that are actually baked into the development agreement with the innovation housing and innovation uses in District Hall. And then, of course, Van Pier also benefited with this agenda on their own, was able to land Vertex in these two buildings. And then, of course, in that empty office building, they hosted a really important accelerator, which is called Mass Challenge, which has since been moved back here into the Mass Mutual building. But they got free rent for one floor of that office building for 4 years. 2016, when the open space, Seaport Green, was open, the ICA now hidden behind one of the big office buildings. And then, more recently, in 2019 and 2018, even though Boston did not win the Amazon HQ2 sweepstakes, Amazon decided to occupy 2 buildings here with no subsidy at all. While at the same time, you showed in Crystal City, right, the amount of public subsidy that Amazon was able to get. Here's the district in 2019. Now, already what we've seen 10 years into this policy is that the big fishes are crowding out the small fishes, the sort of like the active, innovative cluster. And so the question has always been asked. Actually, they asked me now that I'm not a city official, they said, well, Kairos did succeed. Well, I've always said that, and I think this is where this notion that cities are not, I said, well, is it a good part of the city? Is it a place that actually accommodates the kinds of uses that actually people want to see in cities, and it's vibrant? And if it is part of the city and there's nothing innovative about that, or the companies that occupy it, I'm just fine. Because actually, what we want are the fabric of the city, the life of the city to continue and extend to new parts of the city, so that as it's growing, you don't say, oh, here's the innovative part, here's the medieval part, here's the 1950s part, and here's the downtown CBD, because I think those are bad cities. Anyway, thank you for your attention.